Good evening or morning to those in Hong Kong, and thank you all for joining us. I'm Simone Cavallaro, Director of the Stigler Center. Today, we're happy to host Antony Dapiran and Zhiguo for the second webinar in our new series, Freedom of Speech, Hong Kong and the Future of US-China Relations. The series was created to facilitate conversations among leading scholars and experts about the implications of the ongoing events in Hong Kong for freedom of speech, US-China relations, and beyond. Before we begin, please note, we are on the record and we will be posting the event video on our YouTube channel later. If you have any questions for the speakers, we will address them in the last 15 minutes or so. You can submit them via the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. As usual, views expressed by our guests are their own, not those of the Stigler Center or the University of Chicago. We hope that you will join us for more upcoming webinars on the Hong Kong topics or others. So please check our website and also our publication, promarket.org. We're also excited to announce that our Capitalism podcast, co-hosted by our faculty director, Professor Luigi Zingales, has been released today with a new format and a new co-host, investigative journalist and author Bethany McLean, who is well known for her work on the Iran scandal, among others. If you haven't subscribed yet, please do so on the Apple Podcast app, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. Back to today. Please allow me to briefly introduce our speakers. Antony Dapiran is a Hong Kong-based lawyer and author of the books City on Fire, The Fight for Hong Kong. His writing has appeared in The Atlantic, The Guardian, Foreign Policy, Quartz, and more. He is also a regular commentator on television and radio, including BBC, CNN, and CNBC, among others. Zhiguo is the Fuji Bank and Heller Professor of Finance and Jeuck Faculty Fellow at Chicago Booth. He is also the director of the University of Chicago Becker Friedman Institute for Economics in China. And now, without further ado, I turn it over to our speakers. Thank you.
Thanks, Simone. Thanks to everybody for participating in this event. I'm really looking forward to the conversation with our guest today, Antony. So Antony wrote the book called The City on Fire, The Fight for Hong Kong. Obviously, this is on the topic is very interesting, very thought-provoking, and most of us, unfortunately, probably is not on the forefront of this event. This is a really long, actually. It's like a 1 year. So why don't we just ask Antony to just tell us a little bit about the book and why you want to write it. Especially, you know, you are the first have the first-hand experience seeing stuff. These different events start from something really interesting. Kind of it's not a lot of people do not know where this extradition law coming from. You had a first chapter talking about that, and it's a very interesting evolution. I really think that you can give us a broader view about this 1 year event.
Sure. Thank you, Zhiguo, and thank you everyone for joining this evening or this morning, wherever you may be. So I'll respond to your question, Zhiguo, and speak for about 10 minutes or so, and then we can get into the discussion. But yeah, this is the book. If I do the product placement, Prepared City on Fire, The Fight for Hong Kong. I wrote the book having been a close-up observer and commentator on last year's protests. Actually, it's my second book on Hong Kong protests. My first book, written back in 2016 in the wake of the umbrella movement protests that were here in 2014, was called the City of Protest, The Recent History of Dissent in Hong Kong. And it's interesting actually to look back on that time, because where Hong Kong finds itself now, today, is very reminiscent of where Hong Kong found itself in the wake of the umbrella movement back in 2014. The similarities are quite striking in both cases. 2014 and 5 years later in 2019, Hong Kong saw long-term protest movements that caused great disruption in the city and deeply divided the society. Both protest movements ended in 2014. The umbrella movement did not achieve any of the aims, none of their demands were met by the government. Last year, one of the demands were met, that the protesters' demand to withdraw the extradition bill, but their other demands were not met. Following both series of protests, things calmed down for various reasons in Hong Kong, and protests effectively were brought to an end. And in the wake of both protest movements, there was a sense of dispiritedness, a sense, perhaps you could say, of at least a sense of depression even among parts of the community. And that sense that the Hong Kong is experiencing now in some quarters is similar to the experience that there was in the wake of the umbrella movement in 2014. And so my book last year was really an update, not really an update so much as to look at the whole issue again of protest in Hong Kong, because the events of last year were so large and had so many echoes throughout Hong Kong history, going back to a century ago during British colonial rule. And so many of the events that occurred in Hong Kong over the past century had echoes and resonances with events that occurred during last year's protests. And so I wrote the book both to look at the events of last year, of course, analyze what happened and perhaps try and think about why, to bring in some of those historical resonances so that people in particular who haven't had spent their time studying the history of protest in Hong Kong can understand how this wasn't just a one-off event that came out of nowhere, and that the events of last year weren't entirely spontaneous, but had historical connections and historical resonances going back, whether it's 5 years or 20 years or 50 or 100 years. And also to look at some of the cultural aspects of the protest movement in Hong Kong, because protest is in many ways a deeply ingrained part of Hong Kong political culture, and the mode of protest in Hong Kong takes in many different cultural aspects and engages with the city in different ways. But to answer the question you first put, Zhiguo, as to how this all started, it actually started with a very tragic story. A young couple from Hong Kong went away for a romantic getaway holiday to Taipei in Taiwan over the Valentine's Day weekend in 2018. Unfortunately, while they were there, they got into an argument on the last night of their stay in their hotel room. It's alleged that the man of the couple got into a physical fight with his girlfriend and ultimately murdered her, and then disposed of her body in Taipei before flying back to Hong Kong. Eventually, when it was discovered that she was missing, he was brought in for questioning by the Hong Kong police, and it's reported that he confessed to her murder and told police where his girlfriend's body was located, and then Taipei police went and found the body, and indeed it was where he said it would be, and it showed that she'd been murdered. So a very tragic story. But it also presented a legal conundrum, because he was already back in Hong Kong, and under Hong Kong law, you can't be charged for a murder that's committed outside of the territory of Hong Kong. And at the same time, there were no extradition arrangements between Hong Kong and Taiwan. So there was no mechanism to send him back to Taiwan to face justice in the Taiwan courts. And so the government was looking around for a solution, and there were various solutions that they could have taken, but the one that they decided was to amend Hong Kong's law on extradition of fugitives to enable effectively people to be extradited anywhere in the world, regardless of whether there's a formal extradition treaty with that country or not, provided that certain procedural steps were met and certain procedural safeguards were undertaken. Now, that then opened the way not only for this young man to be potentially extradited back to Taiwan and tried for this murder, but under the same law that would enable fugitives to be extradited from Hong Kong to mainland China. And this would be the first time that there was such a mechanism for people to be extradited to mainland China to face trial in the mainland Chinese justice system. And this led to a very strong reaction from the Hong Kong community. There was a sense that there had been previously what people have referred to as a firewall between the Hong Kong and the mainland judicial systems. Under one country, two systems, the mechanism by which Hong Kong was returned to mainland Chinese sovereignty. Hong Kong retained its own legal system, its own court system. It's entirely separate from the mainland, and people feared that this new extradition law would open the path for the mainland authorities to demand the extradition of people from Hong Kong to face trial in mainland courts, which are regarded generally as less transparent and have different procedural safeguards to courts in Hong Kong. And so people protested to try and stop this extradition law coming into force. And then that was the spark for an ongoing series of events that I explore in great detail in the book, but lasted from the beginning of June, really all the way through to the end of the year. Now, of course, we had protests every single weekend, effectively, for that 6-7 month period. But we obviously are not having protests every weekend now, and that raises the obvious question: what happened to end this protest movement and bring us to the point that we are at today in Hong Kong? And there were really three things. The first and most obvious thing that I'm sure everyone would think of is, of course, the COVID outbreak and the related social distancing restrictions, and that certainly is one factor. And from the beginning of the year, as soon as the COVID outbreak was noticed in mainland China, Hong Kong, of course, given its proximity to mainland China, but also given its previous experience with SARS in 2003, there was a very high awareness in the Hong Kong community of the need to take protective measures when there was a potential outbreak of a virus. And so people naturally were already wearing face masks, for example, in the streets of Hong Kong in January, February. People were already naturally reluctant to gather in large numbers in public places, as would be required to have a protest. And this was even before, of course, the formal social distancing restrictions came into force. And then after that, Hong Kong, like almost everywhere else in the world, implemented various restrictions on large gatherings in public places. So that's the first and most obvious factor. But there are two other important factors that brought the movement to a close. Even before the COVID outbreak, the movement had reached, in a way, a natural conclusion with elections here in Hong Kong at the end of November for Hong Kong's what's called the district councils, the local councils of Hong Kong. Not the most important elections in the Hong Kong system, but it was clearly an outlet and a way for people to perhaps express their views rather than having to go to the street to express their views through the ballot box. And they did that with great enthusiasm in the highest turnout ever for an election in Hong Kong. And it was interesting that there was almost a natural sense that in the wake of that election, that the tension in society had resolved somewhat. Now, the result in that election was that the pro-democracy parties won a landslide victory, something approaching 60% of the vote compared to around 40% of the vote for the pro-Beijing parties. And so there was a sense perhaps that people had achieved, if not a victory for the protest movement, at least a victory in terms of political expression, which enabled some of the immediate pressure of the need to protest to be perhaps just taken away as a result of that. So that was the first important thing that really reduced the momentum for protests even before the COVID outbreak. And then after the COVID outbreak, we had a larger and perhaps even more powerful tool wielded by the government against protests, and that was the introduction of a new national security law that many will have read about in the media, and of course that's provoked a strong reaction from governments around the world as well. But effectively, this was a law passed not by Hong Kong's own legislature, the Legislative Council, but passed by China's national legislature in Beijing, the National People's Congress Standing Committee. It was then effectively applied to Hong Kong by executive fiat. And this new national security law is very wide-ranging. It creates 4 new criminal offenses for Hong Kong, including secession, subversion, terrorism, and collusion with foreign forces. Those offenses are very broadly defined and vaguely defined. And they also appear in many ways to be specifically crafted to target certain behaviors that arose in the course of the protests last year. And so there in many ways appear to be crafted to deter the similar kinds of protests and to deter dissent. And certainly they have been applied that way since coming into force by the Hong Kong government, and arrests have been made not only for people who've been allegedly involved in colluding with foreign organizations, but even for things as simple as people possessing flags that contain slogans that that the government believes have breached this new security law. So a quite draconian law, and that's the third thing alongside COVID and the elections that have taken the wind out of the sails of the protest movement and bring us to this point in time where we are at the moment, where notwithstanding that there is still great division in Hong Kong society, I think many people feel that the issues they were protesting about last year still have not been addressed and still have not been resolved. But at the moment, that's no longer finding its expression on the streets of Hong Kong. But no doubt will find its expression in other ways in due course. But we are at a bit of a pause, and as I say, a sense of a certain degree of depression, at least among people who were actively involved in the protest movement previously. So perhaps I'll pause there, Zhiguo, and we can open up a bit more of a discussion.
Great, Antony. So it's a great introduction of the event, and then you offer 3 reasons why, at least right now, is a little bit calm period. I want to get to the point of a national security law immediately. So the last week we had a conversation. It's almost there, right? National security law. If you talk about Hong Kong, you can't escape that problem. I have two questions, and it's a little bit related. One is, it's really related to your book. Your book was written perhaps, I would guess, half a year ago, or published?
Yeah, and it was written at the end of December. So yeah.
Yeah. So you had like almost a page laying out the Beijing's options on the table to address these issues. And you mentioned that you do not think the national security law will be implemented, or at least there's a better way to do it. And you give some very good reasoning, etc. And I would like you to just given what's happening, just tell us. So how do you think? What's your reaction? How do you think about it? Please go.
Yeah, certainly. And just to add a little bit of extra background here, this is not the first time that the issue of the national security law was raised in Hong Kong. It was first raised back in 2003. So there's a clause in Hong Kong's basic law, Hong Kong's constitution, that requires the Hong Kong legislature itself to pass a national security law, for short. This is so-called Article 23 of the Basic Law. When the Hong Kong government tried to do that in 2003, that provoked a massive public protest, and 500,000 people took to the streets. The government ultimately withdrew that law in 2003, and it hadn't been raised again since then. It was effectively a political hot potato in Hong Kong since 2003. So that's sort of this is one of the factors in the background. Now, the other, I think, important thing to bear in mind is that Hong Kong has a a legal system that is a legacy of the British colonial rule. And so there are many existing laws in Hong Kong that were passed by the British authorities to address past political protest or political dissent, including in particular the Cultural Revolution era riots of 1967. And so there is already a number of tools in the toolbox of the authorities here in Hong Kong that they can and they have been using to address protest and dissent in Hong Kong and to crack down on dissent in Hong Kong over the years. And so these were some of the factors, bearing in mind the kind of reaction that national security law had received last time, the fact that there were already so many tools in the box that are being used by the Hong Kong authorities to keep things under control, that I thought, and it wasn't just me, there was a sense in society that in Hong Kong and among various commentators that there'd be no need for Beijing to further provoke matters when things were already quite divided and unstable, to put in place a law that they really had no practical need for. And there was a sense, I think what I write in the book reflects, is a fair reflection of the mood of society at the end of last year. Yes, we'd had this long protest movement. Yes, it had been disruptive, but things were coming under control. Clearly the Hong Kong police and the Hong Kong government had arrested and were beginning to prosecute people. And there was no need in a way for Beijing to further poke the hornet's nest when there are other tools at their disposal. And so that's why when the national security law came out earlier this year, it was a great shock. I mean, there was really a palpable sense of shock among people in Hong Kong, among the commentariat, among the media, and among the general community. And there was shock not only at the fact that Beijing pushed this through in light of that background, but also the scope of the law was much wider than I think what anyone expected. That the scope of the law is beyond what's required by Article 23, for example. And not only that, but the way in which it was introduced was quite shocking. So rather than relying on Hong Kong's own legislature to pass laws for Hong Kong as they do, it was applied by Beijing, passed by Beijing, and then applied by Beijing onto Hong Kong, and that itself was also a big surprise. And so I think, in a way, to see the way that things have turned out with the national security law just goes to show. Well, it goes to show two things. It goes to show how seriously Beijing took the provocations of the protests of last year, and how perhaps how palpable they felt that the sense of threat to their rule and to stability, not just in Hong Kong, perhaps China as a whole. And it also shows to what degree people in Hong Kong underestimated that. And so, yeah, it's been a surprise, and indeed it's had a quite astounding flow-on ramifications, not just for Hong Kong, but from the global reaction as well.
Yeah. So the reason I mentioned the national security law, and as well as mapping to the title of today's talk, is about the clash of views between mainland China and Hong Kong. I meant like at least the views that you can interview on the streets, etc. There's a very widely held view that I show very sympathy, is that often the time that when you see the really bad things, violation, like violence on the streets. By the way, I was during the mid-August, the worst time, I was in Hong Kong. Okay, so I saw that. So imagine after this violence, and then some people gets arrested, and they immediately bailed out. And then after several days, just nothing happened. So there was a common feeling, at least from the mainland side, feel like the whole, justice system, the rule of law, that claim the rule of law, missing its point. And that's why that, there need to be some particularly law that written to prevent the subversion, prevent foreign intervention, prevent all these. And it's really in the basic law, Article 23, you said it. I agree with you on the certain ways, saying that it is whether it's directly through the Beijing imposes that on Hong Kong, but because the basic law says that you should do it by yourself, right? That was the major picture. But I do think that the view that I was expressing was very widely held. So I don't know if you heard about these things or debated with other people around that. And I really would like to know that as I am here just really playing devil's advocate so that, you know, just giving you some opposite views, and then we can debate on that. So how do you think about those things?
Yeah, I mean, I guess a couple of points there. I mean, look, clearly all the kind of violent law-breaking behavior that we saw associated with the protests last year, firstly, there are already obviously laws to deal with that in Hong Kong. It's not legal to vandalize a subway station in Hong Kong. Okay, there are criminal damage laws that apply to that. It's not legal to throw petrol bombs on the street in Hong Kong. There are already laws to deal with that. So certainly in terms of the various acts of violence or antisocial behavior, you know, politically motivated or not, there is already plentiful laws in Hong Kong that deal with that behavior. Now, of course, in terms of the justice system, yes, people get arrested and they meet bail unless there are reasons why they shouldn't be bailed, and in due course they'll go to court, and of course we have a presumption of innocence, and until they're proven guilty by a court, they're presumed innocent. That's one of the fundamental planks of our legal system as it is in the US and elsewhere. And so that seems to I think many people here to be a functioning justice system. The purpose of a justice system is to arrest people for crimes, put them on trial, and if they're found guilty, they'll ultimately be punished. The national security law goes beyond this in a couple of key ways. Firstly, it not only targets those particular acts that were perhaps more extreme under the protest movement, but it also targets acts of incitement. And indeed, it seems to be being applied by the government even for non-violent acts. So from the point of view of, I think many people would think of secession as being, for example, a violent attempt to overthrow a government. But the national security law is being applied not just to violent attempts to overthrow a government, but acts of speech addressed at talking about issues of secession. In terms of bail, the national security law also reverses the presumption of bail. So rather than saying that once someone's been arrested, they're entitled to be bailed unless there's a strong presumption against that, and that they're entitled to be free until they face the court and their guilt is determined by the court, the national security law says that the presumption is they should not be granted bail unless it can be shown that they're not going to commit further offenses. And so there are now people who are in jail, having been arrested under the national security law, denied bail, but won't be facing a trial for several months. So there certainly is a possibility that if ultimately they face trial and are found innocent, they will have been effectively served a jail term of many months while waiting for that trial. So I think that the national security law goes beyond many of the usual safeguards or the usual way in which you would expect a legal system to function. And certainly I sympathize with the view you expressed that people are unhappy that there are people that they perceive to have committed criminal offenses and are still sort of free on the streets. But that's sort of the way the justice system works with the presumption of innocence. And certainly there have been people on both sides of the community who've been unhappy with the outcome of court decisions. And perhaps from the court's point of view, in fact, there was a statement made by the Chief Justice here just over the last couple of days, responding effectively to public criticism from both sides of the political fence. People from the pro-government side complain when judges here find protesters not guilty and release them. People from the pro-democracy side criticize the judges when they feel that people are prosecuted and jailed for what they believe are political offenses. And perhaps it's a sign that the justice system is still working here if people on both sides of politics are unhappy. Because if one side was happy and the other side wasn't, that might be a sign that there's something amiss. But the fact that people on both sides are unhappy suggests that at least the justice system is functioning as best it can in an impartial and independent way.
Yeah. So I largely agree with you on the effect on the like suppose on the very narrowly defined crime. Let's say attacking this
vandalism or arson or whatever.
Vandalism,
yeah.
yes. Those like blue shops, right? Blue shops gets vandalized. Like what happened in Chicago, it's really bad. It's very similar in a way that just from the. I do think that there's a fundamentally different in what happened in Hong Kong and also what happened here. Here it's just different views on whether there are some equality, some social discrimination, all these things. Those things just feel like it is politics, but different politics from Hong Kong. The reason is because it directly gets to the situation of this subversion, secession. And those things are, to me, are the red line of Beijing. And if you ask anybody from mainland, I'm not just officials, like everybody, almost everybody, just because of our history, that you do have a red line to touch. So I arrived in Hong Kong in August 11th, actually, last year. And I walked down the plane and went through the airport that was already occupied. And I saw the flag, which is, it's in Chinese, but in translation, you can do some different translation. It's called Liberate Hong Kong, Reclaim Hong Kong, or Liberate Hong Kong, depending on your translation. I think it just from Beijing's perspective, these two words, guangfu, it has a very subtle meaning in terms of what does it mean, right? And the revolution our times. And sometimes I still also see the US flags, I see UK flags, all these things. I just, as a very, very naturally just seeing those things, it's very hard for me not to connect to secession or subversion. So those type of things, I think that's where these clashing are. Now, I don't think there's a very, very easy way to address those things. This is exactly Hong Kong's biggest problem, where you have all these things that it's very hard to distinguish. In your book, you also said, when Hong Kong younger people said we want autonomous, but the Beijing here is something different. That kind of thing, right? So I would like you to just elaborate on those points and try to give us some perspective on your, as a guy who is living there, seeing all these things.
Yeah, no, certainly, and there are very fine observations, and there are a lot of, as you suggest, many complicated issues tied up in all of those. So I'll try to address some of them. I think the first and perhaps most fundamental point that underlines all of that, everything that you observed, and indeed underlines much of what's been happening in Hong Kong, not just over the last year, but over the last many years, is at the root cause, I think, of all of this is anxiety among the Hong Kong community at Beijing's influence in Hong Kong. and the way that Beijing has ruled Hong Kong. And it's this anxiety and this sense, I think, among Hong Kongers that they want to preserve. They don't necessarily, most, I think, the vast majority don't want Hong Kong to be independent, but they do want to preserve Hong Kong's autonomy. They want to preserve what was promised under the basic law of Hong Kong people ruling Hong Kong and a high degree of autonomy. They want to preserve what they see as the unique Hong Kong culture and unique way of life, and Hong Kong as a distinct place and a distinct identity. And they have anxiety at what they sense is a loss of that autonomy, anxiety at the increase of Beijing's influence in Hong Kong. And the protest movement and the various manifestations of that are different kinds of reactions to that anxiety. And so some of the flags you see are reactions to that. I think in particular that Liberate Hong Kong, Revolution of Our Time slogan is a really fascinating slogan, and there's so much packed into it as you suggested. Those two key words, Guangfu and Geming, sort of Guangfu, there's really no good English translation of that, whether it's reclaim or liberate or restore. There's a sense
Taiwan using that word, right?
Of course, yeah. So
that is where it's coming from, and you can't there's nothing to hide.
Right. So there's historical resonances of Taiwan wanting to retake the mainland in the wake of the Civil War. There's a sense harkening back to even back to sort of dynastic Chinese history, more than a century ago, about restoring the glories of various dynasties. So there's territorial and political things tied up in that slogan, but also cultural identity things tied up in that slogan. Revolution itself, of course, is one of the most powerful and sensitive words in the Chinese political vocabulary. Right? And so just using these words, of course, is very provocative. But what does it really mean? And I can see from the point of view of Beijing, when they see these slogans used, what it means to them has all the connotations you suggested of secession, of subversion, of Hong Kong wanting to break away and be its own independent state. I don't think that's what it necessarily means to the people who use it in Hong Kong, because they have a different historical and political background. They don't necessarily have the same sensitivity to all these words and the political resonances they have. And they are coming to this issue from the point of view of fundamentally, as I said, anxiety about Hong Kong's autonomy and the desire to retain that. So it becomes an expression of a different sentiment. But it also is frankly used as a provocation, as is the waving of the British colonial flag. Now, again, no one in Hong Kong seriously wants the British to come back and become colonial masters again. That's not something that waving of that British colonial flag is intended to express. I think it's intended as a provocation. It's effectively a way of people saying, not from the point of view of politics, but the point of view of people feeling their daily life was perhaps harkening back a sense of sentimentality or nostalgia to their daily life in the pre-handover era. It's intended as a provocation to Beijing, frankly, to try and annoy them and get a rise out of them. So that's the kind of expression that it is. It's not a pro-colonialism expression, but again, it's extremely sensitive to people in the mainland and to the authorities in Beijing, because when they see that, they think of not only British colonial rule in Hong Kong, but the scourge of colonialism generally. They think of the century of humiliation when China suffered greatly at the hands of foreign powers and it was effectively carved up into semi-colonies around the place, and that has a great deal of sensitivity and historical resonance to people in the mainland. So again, seeing that flag from a mainland angle, they receive a different message. The US flags, again, a small number of protesters would wave US flags. People in the mainland see that and sort of have a strong reaction that it appears to them that people in Hong Kong are calling for the US to come and intervene in various ways in Hong Kong. But what it really was, I think, from the Hong Kong protesters' point of view, was an attempt to get attention, to get international attention to their cause, to get specifically US government attention to their cause. And let's be frank, it was a successful protest strategy. Again, it wasn't a call for US imperialism. It was an attempt to get the attention of President Donald Trump and his administration, and to get his administration's attention to the issue and Congress's attention to the issue. And they succeeded in doing that, having images of them waving the US flag beamed onto Fox News and into the presidential bedroom, and ending up in this series of acts of Congress and executive orders from the president. So again, it's the message, the way it was received in Beijing, and the message, the way it was intended by the people sending it here, was different. And you mentioned at the end, I think that's one of the fundamental tragedies of Hong Kong, is that Beijing and Hong Kong speak to each other, but they don't necessarily get the same messages. And this was very clear in the course of the protest last year, when various representatives of Beijing gave a number of press conferences slightly earlier on in the protest movement. They gave some press conferences that were surprisingly, from the point of view of people who know what to watch and who know the way that Chinese officials speak, were surprisingly conciliatory and surprisingly sympathetic to the Hong Kong protesters. But because Hong Kong protesters and people in Hong Kong aren't used to watching and reading and decoding official Chinese party speak, they didn't get the message. And they felt that it was them not being acknowledged, and that Beijing wasn't acknowledging their demands, or that the Hong Kong government was not acknowledging their demands. And so the message was not received. So we have this sort of miscommunication in both directions. The messages that the Hong Kong protesters give out are interpreted by Beijing in different ways, and the messages that Beijing attempted to try to, in some ways, meet the demands of people in Hong Kong, again, were not received. And it brings us to this extreme point we have today, where the national security law is sort of the blunt force instrument that is tried to use to address all these issues. Yeah, so that's just some of the many, and there are many more that we can talk about, but some of the many complex layers that are involved.
Exactly. All these questions is just it's just too short to be completely addressed. Let me divert the questions slightly, but it's still the same, along the same line, so that this will be my last set of questions. Is on one issue that your book said Beijing has alienated Hong Kong's best and the brightest generation. It's used and educated middle class. That's what you said. And it's, in a way, it's just that you would feeling that it's a lost generation. You had some of the statements is like that, because they might, some of them, right? Think about it, the people who, the young middle schoolers who were on the street, and they might have left some mark on their record. All these things. And then you said another thing, is saying that, look, if Beijing is thinking about, there must be some education. So there's another slightly different question, but connected to that Beijing would like to take the strategy, saying that, look, the major difference between the Hong Kong young people and also the younger than me, okay, 20 years younger than me. We read the history. We know, at least the way that the history were taught is a different version from what Hong Kong was taught. So that seems to be a way that Beijing is trying to implement. And I personally think that this is less draconian than a national security law. That's supposed to be that should be the little bit more milder way to go. And I do think this is at least it's not, I would say right, but it's better. How do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean that just to the first point on the generational divide, I think is very important. Just observing the protests on the street, it was clearly visible that the vast majority of participants were young people, were Hong Kong young people. Protest actions were taken not only in the streets, but notably even around high schools, around middle schools. Yeah. They had human chain events where school children would hold hands in long chains, you know, from school to school, or connecting their schools in the streets and chanting protest slogans. Many of the people arrested in the course of the protests have been young people, not only university students, but even high school students. People as young as 11, 12, 13 have been arrested. And not only is this sort of obviously visible on the streets, but it shows through in some very interesting polling data that was taken in the course of the protest. And this is sort of where that statement I mentioned derived from, that reliable public opinion pollsters, when they polled the Hong Kong community, found a division of opinion that basically fell along two lines. That people who tended to be in support of the protesters and against the government were either people who were young, age under 30, or people who had received tertiary education or above. And generally speaking, people who were in supportive of the government and against the protesters were people of older generation, 60 plus, and people who'd received only primary education. And it showed sort of Hong Kong dividing in two directions. There was sort of the young and the educated middle class, who tended to be pro-democracy, anti-government. And there was the elderly, the sort of perhaps recent immigrants from the mainland or working class, together with the tycoon class, obviously, the pro-Beijing business elite, who were supportive of the government. It's interesting for a number of reasons. It's interesting because you know, there's clearly a divide as a result of which, as I mentioned, many of the best and brightest, whether it's Hong Kong's youth or Hong Kong's educated middle-class professionals, were being alienated by the government. It's interesting because if you took that same survey results and sort of took the label off the heading and said that it was a survey of pro-Trump and anti-Trump supporters or pro-Brexit, anti-Brexit voters, you'd probably find a pretty similar divide. And I just found it fascinating that societies around the world are dividing in similar ways. You know, if you talk about an alliance between a rich plutocracy and the working and rural and non-college educated people, that's going to start sounding very familiar to people there in the US. But that's a similar dynamic to what we saw here. And I don't have a good explanation to what was driving that, but it's certainly a phenomenon that we saw here. But to get to the real crux of your question, what's going on with Hong Kong's youth? Clearly, this is primarily a generational battle, if you want to phrase it in those terms. And the vast majority of Hong Kong's youth are in support of the protest movement and disillusioned with their current state of affairs, and perhaps in some despair as to their future. And so clearly, from the point of view of Beijing, of wanting to think about how they're going to better rule Hong Kong, one way they might think about trying to address that, and it's clearly on their agenda, is to do it through the education system. And already this year, we've seen the Education Bureau in Hong Kong, under the current Education Secretary Edward Young, take very strong measures against schools, from things as simple as banning protest slogans in schools, banning the singing of the protest song "Glory to Hong Kong" in schools, and declaring that political issues and political activities should not be pursued inside schools. They're pursuing a very vigorous teacher training program. They are policing school principals and holding them accountable for things that happen in their schools. And then, of course, the next target is the curriculums. And there's been a lot of debate and a lot of ongoing debate in Hong Kong around the so-called liberal studies curriculum, which was a liberal arts subject that introduced into Hong Kong schools with the aim of obviously opening up people's liberal studies abilities and critical thinking, analysis, and those sorts of things. And this is where I think the real battle is, or the real crux of the disagreement is that from the point of view of the government and Beijing, they would like to, they argue that liberal studies has been used as a vehicle to introduce politics into schools to perhaps to politicize Hong Kong's youth, and they want to fix the curriculum to have them taught a version of history or a view of the world that accords with the government's view of the world. People from the pro-democracy side, or people from the liberal side, or however you want to frame it or label it, fear the exact opposite, that this is going to be used as a tool to brainwash Hong Kong's youth, and rather than being used as a tool to teach them critical thinking, which they see as being something that's taught them to analyze and think independently and think critically and to have an objective view of the world, it's going to be used to push a particular political agenda with Hong Kong's youth. And so this is, I think, really a key point of division, and this sort of may be one of the key battlefields in the year ahead.
It's interesting. So I don't know if you knew that Donald Trump is also that we need to change our textbooks.
I heard. We saw this Donald Trump statement about a need for national patriotic education, yes, something like that, and it sounds very similar, very similar to us here in Hong Kong, because we've had this exact same debate going over the last 5 years. But yeah, there are many interesting parallels between what happens in both countries.
In today's world, it's just I sometimes I can't sleep during night because I don't see the truth anymore. Especially history. It's anyway. Let's talk about some questions that pop out in my window. Let me just try to group different things together. So one big part of it is, do you think that the economic and the social policies like housing, healthcare, all these things like could help or revert the fact that there's a bunch of people just really hate government?
Yeah, that's a common question, a common point of debate, and it goes back to the point we were just discussing about Hong Kong's youth. One of the most common explanations, I think, turned to by the government as to why Hong Kong's youth are so disaffected, are so despairing, and are turning to protest in this way, is people believe because of economic opportunity, or the sense that there's not a good future for them in Hong Kong, whether that's because of wage stagnation, the lack of good employment opportunities, the incredibly high property prices in Hong Kong, which make it very difficult for the average Hong Konger ever to be able to afford a decent home to live in. And the theory is that these are really the things that are driving the protests, and this is really what people are worried about. And if only we could, make housing more affordable in Hong Kong and give the youth more hope as to their economic future, that would get rid of some of the political discontent. I've got to say that, while undoubtedly it's a factor, and I don't think we can discount it being a factor driving some of the discontent generally in the Hong Kong community, I don't think that this is one of the main motivating factors behind the protests. In months and months of protests, not once were people ever chanting, slogans, "I want affordable housing," or "give me better economic opportunity." That was never mentioned as any platform or plank or slogan in the protests. Indeed, protesters would even joke about it, chatting with them on the street, asking them about why they're here. They would sort of joke, "Oh yeah, I'm just here, until I can get an affordable flat," and sort of almost make fun of that trope. So it's not to say that it's not a factor, but I think to fall back on it as the only factor and say that if only this was resolved, everything would be okay, I think is misguided. And it seems to assume that people in Hong Kong would take the same deal that is commonly understood people have accepted in the mainland, which is as long as the government makes people's material lives better, they're less concerned about political rights, as long as their material circumstances improve. I don't think that same bargain applies to Hong Kong society. particularly because they already enjoy a raft of political rights which they are fighting to keep. And I don't think that offering them a material trade-off to that is going to be a bargain they're willing to accept. But as I say, it's a factor, but I don't think it's the simple magic bullet that would solve the problem.
Okay, I agree with you. So the next set of questions, putting them together, is more or less is like, what is the current atmosphere there, in the sense that they're after Jimmy Lai, right? But he was bailed, that I followed. All these type of things in terms of the intense relationship between or the environment, intense environment there. The second related question, in response to that, do you see many professionals start to planning to leaving Hong Kong or not?
Yeah, in terms of the current environment, I think it's fair to say that the national security law has put a great deal of fear and anxiety among the sort of protester community. The reaction was almost immediate overnight. People, for example, stores that had displays of pro-democracy posters or protester slogans were sort of taken down, all the displays of slogans in their windows. Various activities such as sort of speaking events or these sorts of things that previously had been very frequently held were suddenly cancelled. People felt, in many senses, afraid to try and gather and protest again. And as these various arrests unfolded, as we saw the arrests of Jimmy Lai and the arrests of other people under the national security law, they engendered a sense of fear certainly among the activist community as to who might be next, who might be arrested, and what they might be arrested for. And I think that has that's created a great deal of anxiety. I mean, it's interesting actually to think about the difference between the reaction to this law in Hong Kong and what the reaction might have been to this law in the mainland among so-called dissidents in the mainland, because there's heard some theories expressed that because of a lack of understanding in Hong Kong about the way that the government in the mainland works, the way that the party approaches and polices dissent, and the way that rule of law is implemented in Hong Kong, perhaps there may be an overreaction in Hong Kong to this new law, and that it's not intended to be used in exactly the way that some people fear, even though it is, of course, being used very actively, and certainly, I think, beyond the written scope of the law. And something that I think was very alarming was when the police, I don't know on what advice, have decided to start arresting people simply for chanting slogans. Now, none of these cases have yet been tried in court. It's going to be very interesting to see how the Hong Kong courts try these cases, because I fail to see how a sensible court could argue that someone simply wearing a T-shirt could be convicted and jailed for inciting secession. So it's going to be interesting to see how the police and the prosecutors and the courts ultimately settle on the parameters of this new law and exactly where the lines are drawn, because we don't know yet. But in the meantime, in the absence of a clear idea, that's causing a great deal of fear and anxiety among the activist community. But more broadly speaking, what impact does that have on the ordinary people, on the professional middle class, for example? I think that fear
those
does
financial
flow through.
Industry international. Do you
Exactly.
have friends who leave?
Yes. Look, I have many friends fall into that category. I was working in that category myself for many years. I think it's fair to see that people generally are taking a wait and see approach. I don't know of anyone who's sort of immediately booking plane tickets and flying out. I certainly know many people who are exploring their options, who are looking at options for immigration and whether they might, if they don't already have foreign passports, whether they can use the BNO path to go to the UK, or whether Canada might be a welcoming place, or wherever, looking at Australia. So certainly people are looking and talking about options. I think one of the things that is going to be most influential in their decision making will be not only, of course, professional opportunity and those sorts of things, but also the education system we were talking about earlier, and what kind of environment they want their children to be growing up in. And I think if there's a sense that their children will be growing up with an education system that is skewed towards what they view as indoctrination, that might be something that pushed them to want to move. So look, certainly there's a great deal of anxiety and discussion, but I haven't seen that flow through to active moves as yet.
So let me just add a one point that I really agree with your of this implementation of whatever law is. The way that China is working is very different, first of all. Second is that I do believe that there are still the Hong Kong is following the common law practice, practicing the common law on the national security law. That would be interesting to see how exactly works. But you will see that the common law says that it's the interpretation, it's intention, it's all these like soft part of that matter. Okay.
Yeah, and I guess the interesting thing just to add is that ultimately Beijing retains the power of interpretation. So the National People's Congress has the ultimate power of interpretation. So if the court makes a decision that Beijing doesn't like, the NPC can step in and overrule it. So the question is then going to be if and when and how they do that, and if they do, how frequently and what kinds of cases they do that. So it's going to be fascinating to watch from an analytical point of view, not so much fun for the people who are actually the cases that are the test cases, the guinea pigs for all of this. But yeah, it's going to be interesting to see that. Yeah.
Okay, so last question, which is also back to the title of the talk. So there's one question coming from the audience is, we see youth at the forefront of Hong Kong protests. How are the youth in China, mainland China, interpreting the protests as well as their country's government? You had your book cover a little bit when I read all these things. That's why I picked this topic. Can you say something about it? Do you have any friends talk to?
Yeah, yeah. Look, I do. I mean, I've lived in Beijing for many years as well, and I have friends both living in the mainland and mainland friends who are working here in Hong Kong. Look, I think it's fair to say that yes, the youth of the mainland have a view generally consistent with the view in the mainland, which is that they feel that the Hong Kong protests have gone too far. They're not generally sympathetic with the Hong Kong protesters. They certainly have the same strong reaction to any idea of secession that is generally held in the mainland. Interestingly, even people who originally were from the mainland, perhaps educated in the West and working in Hong Kong, who may have been generally sympathetic to the protests or to the sympathy to the sentiments expressed by the protesters, as a result of the long course of last year's events, ultimately were turned off by the protests or felt that the protesters lost their sympathy at certain points, whether it was acts of violence, whether it was anti-mainland xenophobia, whereas all these issues that arose that would lead even people you would expect to have more pro-protester views or more liberal views, however you want to define it, to ultimately not be supportive of them. And in sort of the other sentiment would be that they felt the protesters were perhaps naive or not going about their demands the right way, or not felt that their protest actions weren't going to achieve what they were actually after. So many ways in which the Hong Kong protesters, I think, did not get the support of young people in the mainland or young professionals, mainland professionals here in Hong Kong. And I think it's interesting just because one of the things that people would speculate about in the West is that would Hong Kong be a kind of domino that would lead to more dissent in the rest of China. But I think it's very clear sitting here and speaking to people in China or speaking to mainland people here in Hong Kong that was not going to be the case, because there was just no sympathy for the Hong Kong cause outside of Hong Kong in the rest of China, which again is one of the reasons why it was so surprising to see the national security law and the way that the mainland government cracked down so forcefully. I mean, if there was a chance that this would spread to the rest of China, you could understand why there was perhaps a need to do that. But with the prospects of that looking slim, that's one of the reasons why it was surprising to see the strong reaction that we did. But I mean, Zhiguo, you probably also have some understanding of this as well.
Let me just add one thing, which is an interesting interaction with a Stanford undergraduate who somehow was, grown up from Chicago, come back because he take 1 year off, as a lot of people do nowadays because of coronavirus. And he came to me, he said that he has a strong interest in Hong Kong, would like to know more Hong Kong about that. And we discussed, and he said that, I heard about an NSL, National Security Law, and he believes he has strong reason to think or believe, or whatever the words that they're using, that if the UK or US is imposing sanctions, then Beijing will take back. And I tell him, impossible, zero chance. So those type of things, I feel that it's perhaps due to some misunderstanding. I would say that along the way, the entire history of Hong Kong, when they signed the contract, this one country, two system probably has some intentional misunderstanding with each other. Very likely, who knows? But going along the way, I just feel the wedges.
Yeah, I think you've really hit the key point there, which was when the joint declaration was signed in 1984, and looking ahead to sort of 50 years of no change, looking ahead to 2047. I think whether it's Margaret Thatcher or Deng Xiaoping, they both had assumed that China would be changing significantly in that time, and I think they probably both assumed that Hong Kong and China would be converging in many ways. And what's interesting is to looking at it from this point of time where we find ourselves now. Certainly, in many ways, Hong Kong and China have converged materially, I think, far more quickly than anyone would have imagined, to the point where many mainland cities are just as, if not more developed than Hong Kong and any city in the West. But at the same time, developed less quickly in terms of political liberalization. And I think in many ways that may be another one of the factors behind the protest last year, that Hong Kongers suddenly woke up and realized, hang on a second, this is not moving in the direction that we expected it would move, and it's not to our liking. We're not moving towards something that we want to end up being a part of. So, yeah.
Unfortunately, this is a very complicated issue. I feel, so one thing I want to add and then end here is that just a lot of Western reporter or commentators are simplifying the issue there. So, and for people like you, obviously, the details or these things, but often the time I worry about that type of the views towards Hong Kong and China. And thanks, Antony. Great talk. And
thank you.
Usual time, we will go to dinner.
And I'll go to breakfast. Good. So I think
yes, you are the breakfast. Okay, so I will hand over to Simone. Is that right? Or hand over to Rachel?
Yeah, thank you, everyone. That was great. Thank you both, and have a good day, Antony, and good evening to you, Zhiguo. Thanks again. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thanks very much.